what do you have? She says, a guy sent me a tape of this model/actress. And she says, her name is Meghan, and she's about to marry.
There are two schools of thought. One, there already exists a tape.
The internet has a strange way of resurrecting stories people swear are dead. And this time, it didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it in. What started as a few vague whispers online quickly snowballed into something far louder, far messier, and far more uncomfortable for Meghan Markle. For years, there had been quiet chatter tucked away in gossip forums and late-night comment sections. Rumors that most people brushed off as tabloid fantasy or cruel invention. But suddenly, those same claims were back, dressed up with ominous new language. Anonymous insiders and hints that something had been hidden rather than erased. And once the idea was planted that there was more to the story than anyone had admitted. The internet did what it always does best. It ran wild. Timelines filled with speculation. Reaction videos popped up overnight. And people who had never paid attention to royal drama before were suddenly weighing in. The narrative wasn't driven by facts or evidence, but by implication, by tone, by the dangerous suggestion that this time it wasn't just gossip. And that alone was enough to make it explode. What made this wave hit harder than the rest was how deliberately it was framed. No one outright claimed to have proof. No one produced anything concrete. Instead, the language stayed just vague enough to be believable. Phrases like locked away, handled quietly, and known by the right people were tossed around like breadcrumbs, leading audiences exactly where curiosity thrives. According to unverified online claims, the rumor wasn't new at all. It was something Meghan had supposedly been aware of for years. Something she allegedly feared, not because it was true, but because of what it represented. A version of her life before royalty that didn't fit the image she later built. And whether that framing was fair or not didn't matter. The suggestion alone fed directly into a long-standing belief held by her critics, that Meghan reinvented herself the moment she entered the royal spotlight, carefully curating what the public was allowed to see while everything else was quietly pushed aside as the speculation gained momentum. So did the theories. Some online users insisted this was nothing more than a recycled smear campaign, dusted off to generate clicks during a slow news cycle. Others argued that the intensity of the reaction said more than the rumor itself ever could. The question that kept surfacing again and again was a brutal one. If there's nothing there, why does this seem to hit such a nerve? That question alone became fuel, repeated endlessly across platforms. Dissected in podcasts, stitched into TikToks, and debated in comment sections that showed no mercy. People weren't just talking about the rumor anymore. They were talking about her response to it, her history with the media, her relationship with control, and her long-standing tension with public perception. In the digital age, reaction often becomes evidence. And restraint is rarely rewarded. At the same time, Meghan's past began circulating in ways it hadn't in years. Old clips from early acting roles, forgotten interviews, lifestyle blog posts, and appearances from long before royal life were suddenly resurfacing, shared side by side with commentary that questioned authenticity, intent, and reinvention. None of it proved anything, but it didn't need to. The internet has never required proof to pass judgment, only patterns it believes it recognizes. To supporters, this felt like another unfair pylon. A reminder that no matter how far she moved from her former life, it would always be weaponized against her. To critics, it felt like confirmation of what they claimed all along, that there were chapters of her story she preferred to keep hidden, not because they were scandalous, but because they didn't align with the version of herself she now presented to the world. Then came the most unsettling part of the speculation, claims that someone, somewhere, was threatening escalation. Again, nothing verified, nothing substantiated. Just anonymous voices hinting at screenshots, fabricated images, or manufactured proof. In a digital landscape flooded with deep fakes and AI-generated content, the idea didn't seem far-fetched to many people, and that was the real danger. Truth became secondary to plausibility. The fear wasn't that something real would surface. but that something convincing could be created, shared, and believed before anyone had time to stop it. And once that fear enters the conversation, the damage is already halfway done. Through it all, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't just about a rumor. It was about power, image, and control in an era where none of those things are ever fully owned by the person at the center of the story. Meghan Markle has spent years trying to reclaim her narrative, stepping away from institutions she says silenced her, building brands, platforms, and projects designed to redefine how the public sees her. But moments like this expose the uncomfortable truth that no amount of reinvention can fully erase the past, especially when the internet decides it wants to go digging. And the harsher reality is that once speculation reaches a certain volume, denial doesn't quiet it and panic only amplifies it. And that fragility is exactly why stories like this refuse to die. Once a rumor crosses a certain threshold, stops belonging to the person it's about and starts belonging to the audience consuming it. Every pause, every reaction, every attempt to control the narrative gets interpreted, twisted, and reinterpreted again. Silence becomes suspicious. Pushback becomes panic. And outrage, whether justified or not, turns into entertainment. In Meghan's case, the speculation didn't exist in a vacuum. It landed on top of years of tension between her and the public. Years of divided opinion where every move she made was already being scrutinized through two completely different lenses. To some, she was a victim of relentless targeting. To others, she was a master of reinvention who understood exactly how to steer attention when it suited her. This rumor slipped neatly into that divide, widening it further, because it allowed both sides to feel validated in what they already believed. What's rarely discussed in moments like this is how modern scandal culture thrives on ambiguity. The claims don't need to be specific. In fact, the less specific they are, the more powerful they become. Vague wording leaves room for imagination, and imagination is far more dangerous than facts. When anonymous sources suggest something exists without showing it, the audience fills in the gaps themselves, often with versions far worse than anything real. That's why phrases like "people in the industry know" or "it's been quietly handled" are so effective. They imply legitimacy without ever having to prove it. And once that seed is planted, it grows on its own, watered by reaction videos, speculative threads, and commentators who openly admit they don't know if it's true but talk about it anyway. As the chatter grew louder, attention shifted from the rumor to the perceived fallout. People began speculating not just about what was being claimed, but about how it might affect Meghan's marriage, her business ventures, and her carefully cultivated public image. Would this change how brands viewed her? Would it reopen tensions with the royal family? Would it become ammunition for critics who already believed she was hiding parts of her past? None of these questions were grounded in evidence, but they didn't need to be. They created stakes, and stakes keep people watching. The story stopped being about a single rumor and turned into a broader narrative about vulnerability, exposure, and the cost of living in the public eye. There's also an uncomfortable double standard that sits at the heart of this conversation. Hollywood has a long history of quietly forgiving, erasing, or even celebrating the messy pasts of certain public figures while punishing others endlessly for theirs. For some, a complicated history is framed as growth. For others, it's framed as deception. Meghan exists in that second category for many critics, not because of anything definitively proven, but because her story has always challenged traditional expectations. That tension makes her an easy target. The rumor didn't gain traction because it was credible. It gained traction because it fit a narrative people were already primed to believe. As days passed and the noise refused to die down, the online conversation began to shift yet again. Some users started pushing back, questioning why so much energy was being spent on an unverified claim about a woman's past instead of her current work or actual documented controversies. Others pointed out how quickly audiences jump to conclusions when anonymity is involved, and how easily reputations can be dragged through the mud without a single confirmed fact. But by then, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Pushback didn't stop it. It just became another angle to argue about. And this is where the situation becomes almost impossible to manage. In the attention economy, outrage and defense are equally profitable. Every response generates more content. Every denial creates a new headline. Every attempt to move on is framed as avoidance. The machine doesn't care which side you're on, only that you're engaged. Meghan, like many public figures before her, found herself trapped in that cycle, where the only winning move seems to be one that doesn't exist. By the time the rumor began to cool, if it ever truly did, the damage wasn't tied to whether anyone believed it was real. The damage was in the reminder that no amount of status, money, or influence can fully protect someone from the internet once it decides to fixate. And the most unsettling part is how familiar this pattern has become. It's no longer shocking when a rumor with no clear origin suddenly dominates the conversation. What is shocking is how quickly people accept that silence equals guilt and outrage equals exposure. In Meghan's case, the narrative didn't just question a single allegation. It reopened a broader debate about who gets to define someone's past. Every public figure has chapters they've outgrown, moments they'd rather not relive. But for some reason, Meghan's past is treated less like history and more like unfinished business. Critics argue that she invited this scrutiny by constantly reframing her story, while supporters counter that no amount of reinvention should justify relentless speculation. And that clash is exactly what keeps the story alive. Conflict is currency online, and Meghan sits at the intersection of too many unresolved opinions to ever escape it cleanly. As the rumor continued to circulate, another layer emerged that had nothing to do with Meghan herself, and everything to do with modern media behavior. Content creators, commentators, and gossip pages began covering the story not because they believed it, but because ignoring it meant losing relevance. Many openly admitted they had no idea whether any of it was true, but discussed it anyway because people were asking. That phrase alone explains how misinformation survives. Demand creates supply. Once enough viewers want answers, someone will step in to provide speculation packaged as analysis. And with every retelling, the rumor evolves, growing more dramatic, more detailed, more convincing, despite never becoming more factual. There's also a psychological element that's hard to ignore. People are drawn to the idea of a hidden truth, especially when it involves someone powerful or highly visible. The suggestion that there's something they don't want you to see taps into distrust of institutions, celebrities, and public narratives in general. Meghan's complicated relationship with the press, the royal family, and public opinion makes her an ideal subject for that kind of storytelling. To skeptics, she represents control and manipulation. To supporters, she represents resistance and independence. A rumor like this thrives because it can be molded to fit either interpretation. Meanwhile, the conversation quietly drifted away from the original claim and toward something far more abstract: credibility. People weren't just debating the existence of a rumor. They were debating whether Meghan herself was believable. And once credibility becomes the target, facts lose their power. You can disprove a claim, but disproving doubt is much harder. Every past interview, every public statement, every contradiction real or perceived gets pulled into the discussion as circumstantial evidence. Not because it proves anything, but because it creates a story people can follow. And stories, especially messy ones, always outperform reality online. What's rarely acknowledged is how gender plays into scandals like this. Historically, rumors tied to a woman's past carry a different weight than those tied to a man's. They're framed as moral judgments rather than footnotes, as character flaws rather than experiences. Even when framed as speculation, the undertone lingers. Meghan isn't just being questioned about something that may or may not exist. She's being judged for the possibility that it ever could have. That double standard doesn't need to be stated outright for audiences to feel it. It's embedded in how the story spreads and why it resonates. As days turned into weeks, the rumor began to lose its initial shock value. But it didn't disappear. It simply settled into the background, joining a long list of unresolved claims that float around certain public figures indefinitely. And that may be the most damaging outcome of all. Not exposure, not confirmation, but permanence. Once a rumor attaches itself to a name strongly enough, it never fully lets go. It resurfaces during career moves, personal milestones, moments of success or vulnerability. It becomes shorthand for controversy, whether deserved or not. In the end, this episode highlights a harsh reality about modern fame. Control is an illusion. You can manage your image, curate your platforms, tell your story on your own terms, but you can't control how others retell it. Meghan Markle's experience is just a high-profile example of a much broader phenomenon. One where perception outweighs proof and speculation often carries more influence than truth. The internet doesn't wait for confirmation. It doesn't reward patience. It rewards reaction. And as long as that's the case, stories like this will continue to surface, mutate, and circulate, regardless of who they harm along the way. The real takeaway isn't about what may or may not exist. It's about how easily narratives are manufactured, how quickly audiences participate in their spread, and how difficult it is for anyone, no matter how famous, to put the genie back in the bottle once it's out. Because in the digital age, rumors don't need to be true to be powerful. They just need to be believable enough to keep people watching. And that's where the story takes an even darker turn. Because once belief takes hold, reality becomes optional. The rumor no longer needs new details to survive. It feeds on repetition, on tone, on the uneasy feeling that something unresolved is floating just out of reach. People begin to say things like, "I don't know if it's true, but..." And that hesitation doesn't weaken the claim. It strengthens it. It signals intrigue. It signals forbidden knowledge. And suddenly, the absence of proof becomes proof in itself. For Meghan, this meant the conversation was no longer happening on her terms at all. It wasn't about correcting facts or issuing statements. It was about managing a narrative that had slipped beyond control, one that kept reshaping itself every time someone refreshed their feed. What's especially striking is how quickly empathy disappears once a figure becomes polarizing enough. Nuance gets flattened. Context gets erased. The idea that a rumor could be harmful, even if false, is brushed aside in favor of entertainment. Some people argued that public figures should simply expect this, as if visibility automatically cancels out dignity. Others went further, suggesting that enduring speculation is the price of ambition. And that mindset reveals something uncomfortable about the culture surrounding fame. Scandal isn't just consumed, it's justified. If someone has status, influence, or wealth, many feel entitled to tear them down, whether the claims hold weight or not. Behind the scenes, the pressure of that constant noise can't be overstated. Even when a story is baseless, responding to it takes energy, strategy, and restraint. Every move becomes a calculation. Speak up and risk amplifying it. Stay silent and risk being seen as evasive. Push back too hard and appear desperate. Ignore it too long and let others fill in the blanks. This is the trap that modern scandal sets, especially for someone like Meghan. Every reaction is already scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. The internet doesn't allow for neutral responses. Everything is read as either guilt or manipulation, often depending on what the viewer already wants to believe. Another reason this particular rumor gained traction is timing. It arrived during a period when Meghan's public identity was already shifting again. New projects, new branding efforts, new attempts to reposition herself outside the royal framework. Moments of transition are always vulnerable because they invite reassessment. Audiences start asking whether the new version feels authentic, whether it's earned, whether it aligns with the past. And when a rumor surfaces during that window, it feels to some like a crack in the facade. Even if the crack is imagined, it becomes symbolic, a metaphor people can latch onto. What often gets lost in all of this is how little space there is for complexity. A person can evolve and still have a past. They can curate their image and still be sincere. They can dislike rumors and still be confident. But online storytelling rarely allows for those contradictions. It prefers extremes: hero or villain, victim or manipulator, truth teller or liar. Meghan has been forced into all of these roles at different times, sometimes within the same week. And a rumor like this acts as a catalyst, pushing audiences to pick a side rather than question the system that thrives on tearing people apart. Eventually, as with most viral storms, attention drifts. Another headline takes over. Another controversy replaces it. But the residue remains. The search results, the archived posts, the half-remembered claims that resurface whenever her name trends again. This is how reputations erode, not through one definitive scandal, but through 1,000 unresolved insinuations. Each one leaves a mark, even if it's faint. And over time, those marks accumulate into a shadow that follows someone, no matter how far they try to move forward. In the bigger picture, this moment says less about Meghan Markle and more about the environment she's navigating. An environment where anonymity carries power, where speculation can be monetized, and where moral certainty is often replaced by entertainment value. It shows how easily audiences become participants, not just observers, in shaping narratives that can impact real lives. And it raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does curiosity turn into complicity? Because in the end, the most dangerous rumors aren't the ones that get confirmed or denied. They're the ones that linger in the gray space, never fully proven, never fully dismissed, quietly shaping perception in the background. And as long as that gray space exists, stories like this will keep resurfacing, not because they're true,